All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Bill, if you're ready, you want to lead us off?
All right, well, let's go look at the agenda for today. Okay, so I'll give a safety moment here in a second. We're also going to give you a summary of the rebuilding service subgroup. As you remember from last meeting, we established this subgroup really to talk about how we rebuild service over time. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time on the mobility plan for the future and covering multiple areas. First, talking about our financial picture in terms of where we're at, and Doug McLeod will be doing that. We're also going to be talking, and hopefully some of you actually were able to participate in the survey that we sent out ahead of the meeting to talk about the drivers, which means, what's driving kind of the transportation decisions, at the agency over the, into the future, and kind of what are some of those things that we really need to account for. Then we're going to talk about a tool that we're going to be using as part of that process and looking at the future, which is a really interesting tool that one of our consultants on the team has, that they've been worked with across multiple projects across the country. And then we're going to talk about RTD's roles in integrating, trying to define what that is. And then lastly, we'll give a series of updates on a couple of a few key areas, including our zero emission vehicle evaluation and our facilities analysis, as well as kind of our public and stakeholder engagement. So let's go to the safety moment. So I know many of you, since it's summer, are outdoors a lot, and I know lately we've had a fair amount of turbulent weather. So I thought I'd just give people an update on kind of, if you're caught outdoors in lightning, a few things to consider. Immediately get off higher elevated areas such as, mountains and or high hills. Crouch to the ground, but do not lie on the ground. Never shelter under an isolated tree. Never use a cliff or a rock overhang as shelter. And then obviously stay away from water and don't be in water when you're and there's a lightning storm out. And then finally, stay away from objects that conduct electricity, such as barbed wire fences. So anyway, let's go to the first slide there. Okay, so like I said earlier, we did have a rebuilding service subgroup update or meeting about 3 weeks ago. At that meeting, we had Doug McLeod, similar to what he's going to be doing today, give a financial update, talk about kind of how we're using our federal COVID relief dollars that we've been getting and how that looks into our kind of mid-range financial plan. We're also going to we also got a ridership overview or an update from Jesse Carter, talking about the trends that we're seeing on ridership, which we are seeing an uptick, which is great. And then we did ask the group, they could share with us kind of their thoughts about how to serve, that they can provide insight into service decisions. And we got some really good feedback related to some information that they'd like to see as, we make decisions and get input from them about changes in service as we move forward. So with that, let me turn it over back to Holly to go through the rest of the agenda.
Super. Thanks, Bill. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the mobility plan for the future, and all the whole rest of the slide deck and the information we'll be sharing really relates to that piece of the effort. And we thought it might be helpful to have a quick discussion about the process that this will take. We've had this in a couple different forms, but I think this one might work a little better. And then talk about some key questions that we're going to answer through the process, and when we'll be doing that during the process. So on the left side of this illustration, we have the current state, which is what we've been looking at. What is RTD doing today? And how is that working? And that we're also looking at this in a pre-COVID, so that we know sort of what the state of normal is, as well as during COVID, as Bill talked about. Then we're looking at the future state, and this is where we're talking about the scenario planning. So what could the future hold for us, and how do we plan around that? Then the next step is to identify how RTD should respond to this. What are the policies, strategies, the operating environment and enhancements, capital investments? How does RTD respond to the future under these scenarios? And then ultimately we're getting to implementation priorities, sort of that vision, and all of that together is what makes up the mobility plan for the future. So one of the, and I just want to say that between meetings, we have dialogue and comments that come in from the groups, and it's really helpful to hear from you what's working and what's landing, and where you think, what are you doing? And this is not helpful to the conversation. So please keep that feedback coming, because we do try to, shape the meetings to be as useful to your time and helpful to RTD as possible. So one of the comments that we got in between meetings this time was, when are we getting into the hard stuff, and where's that happening in the process? So we thought we'd outline these questions to help understand the process that we're going through, and when we get to answer some of the questions that are really key to the success of the mobility plan for the future and this Reimagine process. So you'll see in July and August, today we're going to tee up the conversation about RTD's current financial state. So Doug McLeod with RTD has joined us, and he's going to help us really understand today and in the next 5 or so years, what do the finances look like for RTD? And then Simon Mosbaugh with WSP, who's on the consultant team, is going to talk about how we're using that information and RTD's tools to look out to the future to help understand what that future state is as well. There's also been questions about how do we plan for the future mobility needs and trends. And people have asked, well, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. How could we possibly plan for that? And that has been sort of a concern. So today we're going to show you and start to illustrate a planning tool, which is scenario planning, that we will use to help us understand what the future may hold, and how, if different things come to pass, how RTD will respond, and what the mobility in our region will look like in the future. And then ultimately, we're trying to find out how RTD responds. One of those is what we talked about in our last meeting, is RTD being a mobility integrator. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today as well. So in September and October, we'll have some, hopefully, if the modeling and the scenario planning goes smoothly, we'll have some outputs for you to look at to tell you what those trends in the future look like. So this would be things like, how much ridership could RTD anticipate? What is the average trip length? What is the trip length? What is the vehicle miles of travel, depending on the scenarios that come to pass? And then we'll look at those outputs from the regional travel model, and we'll try and figure out if RTD's current commitments and their current state make good sense, and also start to make recommendations to the RTD board of directors for other actions that RTD could take to respond to those futures. And then in November and December, we start to get to that prioritization and understanding that fiscal constraint. We don't have all the money to do what we'd like, so we're going to need to prioritize those that are of highest interest and meeting RTD's goals. And we'll be working through that through the whole time, but in November and December, we'll put a key focus on that. So are there any questions about that process? Are there other questions that you feel like you wanted answers to, that you are expecting through this process? I guess I'd like to open it up and see if there was anything that you felt like in that sort of high level overview that you'd like to see in there. Anything in chat? Let me go look. Okay, well, if there's nothing now, that's fine. If you have something that pops up as we move through the process, please write in chat and we'll try and circle back on that. So for now, I think our next item up is Doug McLeod. He's going to help us understand the current financial picture in the near term.
Thank you, Holly, and good morning, everybody. Please go ahead and go to the next slide. So want to go back in history a little bit and talk about what happened to RTD back in about the March timeframe of 2020. So what we saw throughout the COVID pandemic was about a 70% reduction in ridership. That was system-wide. We had some pockets that performed a little bit better. On the A line, we retained more ridership, and we had some bus lines where we actually had more retainage of ridership. We saw a lot of losses on our light rail and some bus routes. So that was a pretty big impact because it also affected our fare revenue. So what happened is we've been experiencing about $150 million annual revenue loss, mostly from a fare revenue loss. So our fare revenue is projected to be about $168 million in 2021 before the pandemic. We're trending more in the $68 million range, so less than half. And most of that is attributable to our revenue losses, which is about 15% of our revenue losses at $150 million annually. In addition to that, when we projected future years going forward, we have projected growth in our revenues due to opening of new lines, more ridership growth, et cetera, as well as revenue growth from sales and use taxes. So that seems to be a little bit more muted going forward, in addition to the outright loss from volume. Some of the actions that we undertook in 2020, layoffs. We had about 89 salaried employees that were laid off in January of 2021. We had initially laid off almost 400 represented or frontline employees, and then recalled them when we got additional COVID relief funding. We had put in furloughs in 2020 and planned to do those in 2021, and we had significant reductions in other expenditures, most notably our state of good repair. A lot of those state of good repair projects to keep our assets in a state of good repair had been pushed out even before the pandemic, just due to financial constraints at the time. That problem was just exacerbated with COVID because we had to push out additional projects to the point where we were only forecasting we could fund about 70% of those state of good repair projects starting in 2022. And then, of course, as Holly mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future state of transit and funding sources. Not sure what that's going to look like going forward with work from home, some of the other things that are going on. It seems to be a real shift in travel patterns, basically. So the dust hasn't settled from that, and that will help us align our expenditures once we know what that looks like going forward. So some of the financial challenges that we see at RTD are, number one is meeting our RTD fiscal policy. So the RTD board has set out a fiscal policy. And in addition to that normal annual fiscal policy, there were some COVID policies related to that in terms of recovery or emergence from the COVID fiscal crisis. But the main point of that fiscal policy is to establish a financial foundation for RTD, and that is to have 3 months of operating reserves, meet certain ratios such as debt coverage ratios, just a conservative approach to making sure that we have a little bit of money set aside for these emergencies. Nobody could have predicted the COVID pandemic and the impact that had, but we tend to have fluctuations in the economy that drive our revenues, so we like to have a little bit in the bank. We have a balanced budget policy in which each year the board appropriates expenditures for the upcoming year, and we generally build those around the expected revenue. So to have a balanced budget, the incoming funds equal the outgoing funds, and that includes the provision for fund balances as well. So we really spend everything that comes in. So every time we change something or there's new additional expenditures, there's a trade-off where we have to substitute another project that was planned. One of the other items that we need to think about when we look at our finances is one-time revenues versus recurring revenues. With the COVID relief funding, those are considered one-time revenues. They won't continue year after year, unlike our sales and use taxes, fare revenue, and some of our other sources. So we have to be very considerate about how we spend those hopefully towards more one-time expenditures, and that's within the fiscal policy too, because at some point that funding will run out. Future level revenues and expenditures, that's yet to be determined. We're trying to forecast that. We get more information each month that goes by about the current state and our revenue picture. And then we can establish what kind of expenditures we can afford. We do have borrowing restrictions. We've pretty much used up our TABOR authorization, taxpayer bill of rights, in terms of what the voters have allowed us to borrow. So if we were to undertake projects, assuming we could find the funding for large projects, we would need to probably go back to the voters for additional borrowing capacity. And then, of course, the big initiative with RTD is we have a strategic plan that's emerging. It's pretty well set at this point. The board of directors has agreed to the strategic direction, which consists of 4 success outcomes that have been identified. We'll want to align our budget with those 4 success outcomes to ensure that we spend our money towards that strategic direction. Some of the specific financial challenges that we have some one-time and periodic expenditures needed. I mentioned state of good repair that we've pushed off. So that at the last time we did the midterm financial plan, which is our 6-year plan, was back in November of 2020. We had $205 million in backlog state of good repair needs. That includes bus replacements, a lot of facilities equipment, and just maintaining the assets that we have already put in place. There's some other outstanding one-time issues that we're not certain of. We have a lawsuit going on with Denver Transit Partners in which they're trying to recover expenditures they undertook for the delays in the opening of some of the Eagle P3 lines. We're not sure what the outcome of that litigation is going to be, so that could result in a settlement payment from RTD. We're just not sure at this point. And then we're on a recurring basis, we'll have service levels. So whatever we set those service levels at and fund those, we have to be mindful of the fact that when one-time funding runs out, if we use it for service levels, that runs out, we have to reduce service again, just like we did back in April of 2020 when we reduced down to 60% service levels. So that creates a lot of issues for our customers. So we have to be really careful about how we expend our funds. There's contractual inflationary increases that we have to be mindful of. We contract out about 58% of our fixed rate services, and those have contractual increases each year to adjust for inflation, wage increases, et cetera. We have the collective bargaining agreement negotiations that we're going into with that CBA expiring February of 2022. We're not sure what's going to come out of the fare study and equity analysis. That's an 18-month project, but it could result in lower fares in addition to the lower volume. So that could have an impact as well on our financing. I already mentioned some of the TABOR restrictions we have, but we have a large debt load, and I'll go through that here in a couple slides. And then finally, we have underfunded pensions, both on the salaried and represented side, that it'd be nice to address those at some point, but we do have that obligation. Here's just a quick update of where we stand. We received 3 apportionments in COVID relief funding, that being the CARES, CRISA, and ARPA funding. CARES RTD received notice of in 2020, back in May. We have drawn all those funds down to maintain services. So when I mentioned we brought a lot of those frontline workers back, we used a lot of that funding to maintain that employment, which is helpful to us, certainly as we restore service, because there's a lot of training and costs involved, as well as recruitment, trying to get employees on board. CRISA funding, we received that apportionment in January of this year. We've started to draw that down. That has been designated as 180 million of that. So almost 90% of that 203 million going towards restoration of service, to be capped at $30 million additional service levels starting in June of this year. So we're trying to spread that money out over 6 run boards, or basically 2 years. Then the ARPA funding. The ARPA funding was the most recent round of apportionments that we received. Just got the guidance on that on Monday of this week. In each one of these rounds of funding, they're all required to be used for operating expenses, basically to maintain our services so that public transit, which is considered an essential service, can continue to move people, which is our primary goal. So we're about, halfway through drawing all that money. Next slide, please. So here's where we did a projection back in May of this year. So all throughout COVID, it was very uncertain as to how our revenues were going to emerge. Initially, when we looked at what we thought might happen, sales and use taxes are about 2/3 of our revenues. Even the University of Colorado Lead School of Business, who does all of our sales and use tax projecting, had assumed there would be losses of about $250 million annually. So it was a very dire picture at that point in time. Since then, we've seen sales and use taxes have remained pretty steady and actually much better than we thought. Not quite up to the levels that have been projected pre-COVID, but fairly close. So those have been strong, which has been super helpful to us. But what we're showing here is in the gray bars, our projected revenue streams, funding sources, and then the orange bars are the expenditures. So what this depicts is that we have a couple of spikes in our revenues in 2020, 2021, and 2022. Those are really due to the drawdowns of the COVID funding. We've also assumed that we're going to draw some of the ARPA funding in 2023 and beyond, because that ARPA funding is supposed to be obligated at least through 2024 per the FTA. So essentially what we're doing is we're adding back service on those orange lines, which you can see growing, and also taking care of some state of good repair needs. Then there's some inflationary cost increases built in there too. But I think the takeaway from this is as you get out to 2024 and 2025 is that one-time funding drops off. We still don't know what our revenue picture is going to look like, but even assuming moderate growth in our sales or in our fair revenue and our sales and use taxes going forward, you can see that that gray bar drops down to below our expenditures. So we still have a problem to solve going forward after 2025 if we're going to maintain these expenditure levels. We think though, if you look at the numbers there over at the right, the numbers in the I guess Excel spreadsheet down below, it's almost a break even over that time period. We have some years where we spend more and other years where we get more revenue than expenditures, but overall, we're basically spending everything that we project that's coming in, even the additional one-time COVID relief funding. One thing to point out, it's down there in the red, is one of the biggest challenges we have as an organization is our debt service levels. On the base system, it's not so much of a concern. It's only about 10% of our revenue. So that leaves everything else after that 10% is taken out. The other 90% of our revenues can go towards service, state of good repair, et cetera. But the first thing we always do is pay our debt. That's critical. Conversely, on the fast track side, their debt load is 55% of their revenue service. So that's a significant burden for the Fast Track's operations. And Fast Track's operations, we pay that debt first, so 45% of their revenues is left over for operating expenses. So that's why when you hear publicly that we can possibly build things if we were able to find funding, but we don't necessarily have the revenues to support operating those. So we have to be very mindful of how we expend those. Just a couple of things to point out on the base system. The debt service will decline in 2024. 2024 is when the bonds will be paid off. Those bonds were issued for T-Rex. At that point in time, the base system will be subject to tabor restrictions for revenue growth. So we have that challenge as well. So the base system can fund fast tracks, but not vice versa. So even the best scenario where the base now has more money freed up after 2024 because their debt burden will be less, that revenue may be muted because of the fact that they're limited to certain growth restrictions under tabor. Fast Tracks, their debt is actually scheduled to be paid off in 2050. So we've got about almost 30 years worth of debt to pay off. It's fairly steady in terms of the debt service load, which is about $170 million over on Fast Tracks each year. So that 55% will probably drop over time as their revenues grow. So that's one good thing. However, our costs will increase likewise. So it's going to be a challenge on the Fast Track side to maintain the service levels and service the debt. So I think that's my last slide. Holly, I know sometimes I miss a few things. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that was great. I do have a question though, just to make sure before I say something incorrectly. So when the Reimagine team started the system optimization process back in 2019, we knew that RTD was expending more in operations than was sustainable. There were higher expenditures than there were revenues in that base year. And so we went in with we were to develop the system optimization plan to like a 90% level. And I think you have a number that it's somewhere around that where we think we could get to by this, sort of in the near term when we're sort of out of this immediate moment and into that midterm. What percentage is that for the operation?
Well, thanks for bringing that up, Holly. So yeah, you're right. So what our target would be is 85% service levels of where we were pre-pandemic. That's really built around the fact that the funding that we've identified that we think we can maintain would support an 85% service level of where we were. That will be phased in over time because one of our other challenges is that we don't have enough operators to provide that 85% service level. So if you were to look at our service increases that we've put in place with the June run board and the September run board, those are really stepping up to 70%, then with the goal of getting closer to 85% going forward, but it takes time to get the resources in place that we need. So thanks, Holly, for pointing that out.
Right, yeah, that's super, and that's really helpful, thank you. Okay, so I would say that is good information for us to have. I don't think it's not the answer that we want. We want you to have a lot of money, Doug, so we can go do a lot of service.
Me too. Me too.
But I do want to open it up here because I feel like this is a really important piece of the puzzle for us as we move forward with conversations. So does anybody have questions for Doug? You can pop them in the chat too.
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand, yeah.
Jump in. No question?
All right, well, I don't think you're going to be off the hook quite that easy, Doug, but we'll have you back next time for more updates. And certainly if questions come into your mind as we are still on the call for the next hour or so, please raise your hand and Doug will be here with us. Are you going to be able to stay with us for the?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Doug. Okay, so we have a good handle on this near-term picture for the next 5 or so years. And the WSP, our partner WSP, is on board to help us understand a bit longer term what the financial picture might look like, and also to help us evaluate the tools that RTD currently uses and put in place some best practices. So Simon Mosbaugh has joined us, and he's going to give us an overview of where they're headed with that. We don't have any answers just yet, but an overview of what you'll see in the next couple of months.
Thank you very much, Holly. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're going to, over the next couple of months, we're going to build on what Doug has just presented, really, to sort of like look at the high-level outlook to 2030, so the next 10 years, and then to 2050, the next 30 years. And Doug has already laid out a lot of bricks that are going to contribute to build that house, including the fact that like the fast track debt is currently retiring in 2050. So, and that high level, like 10-year and 30-year outlook is really going to help us determine what resources are available. Like, and I think both Doug and Holly have already mentioned that for any new project and any additional service beyond the current service or beyond the 85% level that Doug has mentioned. So, and a key piece of that is going to be the operating cost by mode. Like this is what we mean by like light rail and the commuter rail, the bus. The major capital projects already committed, for which there is already a debt service, and I think we got a very clear presentation on that. And that debt service both for base and fast tracks with the nuances that Doug has highlighted as well. On the revenue side, Doug has already described the sales and tax forecast. It's kind of difficult to go after Doug because I feel like he's already covered this so well. We are also going to look at fair revenues. I think there is a lot of uncertainty regarding fair revenues in the future that has been alluded to, and I think this is something we're going to continue to look at, as well as ancillary revenue, such as advertising, for instance. And we'll get back to you in the fall with preliminary results for this 10-year and 30-year outlook. If you want to move to the next slide, Holly. Thank you. So, and then as Holly alluded to, we will also look at any potential for improvements to current tools and current processes that RTD is using, right? There are some questions like financial plan updates, is there a better way? Is there a way that would even improve the communication in terms of like scope and frequency of these updates? Are there lessons learned from other agencies that are in a similar situation as RTD that have undertaken a lot of large projects that could help us maybe simplify, smooth any opportunities that may be out there for consideration to enhance the tools and processes that RTD already has. In some areas, you may find that like what RTD is doing is great and there is no need for change. And in other areas, we may find that, oh, maybe we could actually shift that a little bit. Maybe we could shift that frequency, for instance. Options to prioritize projects. That's also an area of potential growth or enhancement for the agency beyond what they're already doing. And I'm not going to get into detail of the different options, which are not exclusive from each other anyway. But key question is going to be, we need to make sure that we prioritize the state of good repair projects, right? As Doug mentioned, there is a backlog and we need to prioritize the safety of our riders, the safety of the employees. And then like among other projects, how can we best prioritize them based on the goals and the priorities of the agency? So that's really, in a nutshell, what we're going to look at over the next couple of months and come back to you in the fall with preliminary results on the financial outlook, as well as preliminary recommendations on any areas where there could be some ways to do things a little differently that might help RTD improve its processes. So that's all I had, Holly, unless I missed anything.
I think that seems great. Lots of good information to come. All right. Thank you, Simon. So this next piece, we're going to talk about how we best make a plan for the future mobility needs and trends. And I think this is a really interesting piece of the process, and we have a couple of great tools to help us with this. I mentioned this earlier, but one of the comments that we've received is, and this has just sort of been not even necessarily about Reimagine, but just in general, is how do we plan for the future when we have no idea what is going to happen? We're coming out of COVID. We don't know how are people going to go back to the office? Are they not going to go back to the office? We have lots of emerging trends and technologies. So how can we possibly make a plan when things are in flux? And one of the things that planners do, what we do is we look to the future and we try to look at scenarios, and then we create recommendations around those scenarios, understanding that nobody ever has a crystal ball of exactly what the future holds. But what we try to do is look at a variety of futures that could impact, in this case, mobility needs. And what we're going to try and do in this group and with our technical working group is to identify strategies that RTD should implement that make them resilient and nimble to respond to the future, to a future that could look one way, it could look like A, and it could look like B, right? So when we're talking, we sent out a survey and asked you about driving forces. When we talk about driving forces, we're specifically asking about what driving forces in our world and out there will impact future mobility of our region, and specifically will impact how RTD can attract riders to their system. And we want to get a handle on that so that we can start to look at a few really key driving forces that will have a large impact and that we want to make sure that we plan for in the future. So thank you to those of you who filled out the survey. On the left side, you'll see the survey results. And up in the top right, these are the most disruptive things, the most uncertain driving forces, and those with the most impact to future mobility are going to be in that top right quadrant of this graphic that we're looking at here. And in the top right, you'll see item 12, which is funding. And I think that is definitely one that we want to keep our eye on. We also have up in the top right, disruptive technologies are more to the right than they are having a large impact. Workforce availability is one that rises to the top. Policies, both at the federal and state level. So I think these are all really good ones. And then on the right, these are some of the driving forces that you all input for consideration. And here we'd see things like fuel cost, we see climate change, as well as climate change mandates that may have an impact on RTD's ability to provide service, or actually more like capture riders on their service. So I think these are some great input that we've received here. And what we're hoping to do today, I'd like to give you some feedback that we heard from the technical working group. And I'd like to run an idea past you. When we talk about scenario planning and we talk about the future, it could go a whole bunch of different directions. And our goal here today is to identify 2 or 3 really key driving forces that you would like this team to look at in more detail to help you make some good recommendations to the board of directors on how RTD should respond to that future. So if we want to scroll down one, let's actually, Katie, well, let's not do this. One quick thing before we go into there. We're going to have our Cambridge Systematics team member is developing a tool for us that is a travel demand model tool, and it is part of helping us explore that future. So it will help us understand what those travel demands and the travel patterns might look like under different scenarios. And I think Michelle has joined us. Michelle, are you out there?
I'm here.
Wonderful, thank you. Michelle is going to tell us a little bit about the EMAT tool. And then after that, I'm going to make a recommendation to you based on both what we know about the EMAT tool and what we heard from the technical working group. And I'd like to hear from this group if you feel like the key driving forces that I've flagged based on what we know about EMAT and what we heard from the technical working group seem like a good approach to you. So Michelle, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the EMAT tool?
Sure. So typical model forecasts, they need some sort of assumptions about the future. They need it to be told, this is the population that we're going to have, this is the employment, this is going to be the cost of fuel, etc. But what the exploratory modeling and analysis tool, or EMAT, does is it recognizes that there is uncertainty in the future. And this tool allows us to vary these inputs or these assumptions and then quantify the impacts of all those different possibilities and different future scenarios. This allows us to make robust decisions because we can see how ridership, for example, is impacted by these different possible futures. For example, we can see if ridership on local services downtown stays pretty constant regardless of, say, like how many people are working from home or different micromobility options. So that just lets us know where are our most robust investments going to be made given all these different uncertainties. So on the left here are the inputs or the uncertainties that we plan to analyze. So we can vary at a full range of possibilities of different service levels that RTD can provide as a result of not having enough of a workforce to be able to provide enough services we would like, or not enough funding availability. So how those can impact different service, and then different teleworking or work from home assumptions, if they can continue to keep working from home, or if we go back, revert to how we were before, different micromobility options that might help provide additional access to transit, and then the impacts of varying parking costs at park and rides or destinations. So we can analyze these different assumptions, but also the combinations of each of these. And then on the right-hand side is how we can assess the impact. So this will help you make different decisions on strategies to mitigate some of the results of these scenarios. So next slide. Here is an example dashboard of the EMAT tool from a different project in a different region. And here we want to select an outcome or an output or a metric. And so here we selected where we see high transit mode shares. The next slide. And then we can look to see under what scenarios do we get high transit ridership. So here we're looking at telecommuting as an example. And you can see the orange is where we have high transit ridership, and then the blue is where there is low transit ridership. So you can see the impact. You can see how if we're increasing the assumptions of how many people are telecommuting, there are fewer scenarios where high transit can be achieved. But then you can also see in the blue section that there are scenarios where even when no one is telecommuting, we can get some low transit ridership, and there are some fewer scenarios where we get high transit ridership, even with a lot of people working from home. So this tool kind of allows us to assess under what conditions can we still achieve those high transit scenarios, even if there's a lot of people working from home. So here is, just giving you that full range of uncertainties that were analyzed in this other project. So in addition to telecommuting, they also looked at CAVs and TNCs and different demographics and different service level assumptions. So you can look at all of these different scenarios in this one visualization tool. That's all I have.
Okay, that's super, Michelle. So I'm gonna,
Hey, I'm sorry, Holly, we do have a quick question from John Taylor. How are you assessing telecommuting rates is the question.
It's a great question.
This is a great, Michelle, I was just going to tee you up. That is a great question, because what this EMAT tool does is allow us to assess varying telecommuting rates and against, so that we can look at that future. So Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
No, that was exactly what I was going to say. That's the benefit of this tool, is we don't have to pick one number. We can understand that we don't know exactly what that one number is going to be. So let's look at a range of possibilities.
Yeah, the tool is it's incredibly powerful. And I think for where we landed right now, especially in this evolving time of coming back to work from COVID and the future being unknown, although I always say to everybody, the future is always unknown. We actually did never know. We just kind of thought we did, right? So we never know what the future holds. And what this tool allows us to do is look at a bunch of varying inputs so that we can understand the strengths and weaknesses of RTD's response to those varying futures. I think it's going to be a tremendous tool. I had an opportunity to chat with a couple of other agencies who have used this tool. It's incredibly powerful. We're going to have a lot of information to work with. I think it will allow us to start to step away from our anecdotal sort of speculation about what we think the future might hold and try to use some numbers and data that are based in, the best we can do with a pretty powerful tool to help us understand those future mobility demands and needs. So I think it's going to be a really useful tool for you.
Excellent. And then we have one more question from Jackie. How are you assessing changes in past programs or other efforts RTD may take to increase ridership?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Jackie. We do have in the background of the tool, there is a cost associated with traveling. So there's a cost associated with parking. There's a cost associated with using transit. There's a cost associated with using your automobile as well, like a fuel cost. And there's a cost associated with your time as well. The model has a lot in the background. That can be just like the other inputs that Michelle talked about can be varied as well. to help us understand how it might attract ridership or how it might depress ridership, depending on where it is within that spectrum.
I think Bill might have had something to add to that question as
Okay.
well.
Yeah, I was also going to say that, we are going to be taking a detailed look at impacts or changes to past programs and fares as part of the fare study. So we will look at very specific modeling to how changes in past programs will affect ridership when we get into the fare study next year.
Thank you, Bill. And then it looks like we have one more question. Does the tool include assessing changes to modal share of single occupancy vehicles?
Yeah, so the model itself does work to assign mode share based on inputs that we put in, and those will vary depending on the scenario that we're looking at. So yes, it will do that.
That's all our questions for right now. But keep them
Okay,
coming.
good. Michelle, any other clarifications there for the group based on those questions, comments?
Nope, I think you covered it.
Okay,
Good
great.
questions. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, they are really good questions. So the next piece of the puzzle here, and we're starting to see what we feel is important, right? Based on the questions that you're asking. The next piece of the puzzle is for us this tool is going to give us I dare say, an infinite amount of data. We're going to have so much data, and we're going to be able to slice and dice the outputs a whole bunch of different ways. What I think will be important for the Reimagine process is for us to try to focus our energy on a few key variables that you think are those that are most important to impacting RTD's ability to capture ridership in the future. So while we could look at it every possible way, using the model for usefulness of this, for us to develop responses, we need to identify those that are the most important factors for us to consider. So now that you've learned a little bit about what the EMAT tool can do, and we talked a little bit about those driving forces up above and what we think are important. If we scroll down to the next one, I want to talk a little bit about the technical working group feedback. So when we went through it, I would say there were some that rose to the top more than others, but this list on the left is what the technical working group identified as being particularly important when we're talking about scenario planning. So they talked about funding, workforce availability, the level of service that RTD is providing being a key factor in how much we can attract, how many people we can attract to the system, the levels of telecommuting and work from home, as John pointed out. Competing modes, that's a little, when we talked about competing modes, someone asked, and what modes in particular, and this is really any mode. And one of the comments that the technical working group made was, maybe you should really focus on that single occupant vehicle. So I think that's an interesting and sort of to the comment that was made. Parking costs, land use, local policy, federal and state policy. Those are the ones that, and we had dialogue around a variety of these, but these were the ones that seemed to sort of rise to the top. We didn't do any explicit voting exercise to say that this is what they wanted, but so what I would like to propose to this group, based on that input and the feedback that we got from the survey that we did on the driving forces, is an approach that would focus on three driving forces. The first is, and those are on the right side of the screen here. So we would use the EMAT tool to look at service levels. So this would help us, this would be our surrogate for funding. If we have funding, we have the opportunity to provide really good service. If we have not sufficient funding, the service would be low. So if we sort of think, and the EMAT tool will provide a spectrum in there, but this is, on one end, we have high, lots of service, really high quality. And on the other end, we have somewhat lower service generally through the region. This would also be, so that is for funding. It would also be a surrogate for workforce. We can only provide really great and a lot of service if we have the workforce available to operate that service. On the other end, if you either don't have funding or you don't have workforce, you have a lower level of service available. Federal policy, this could also be a surrogate for federal policy and state policy. If we're, have policies in place that are very supportive of transit, we're probably going to be able to provide more or less transit. So anyway, I think service levels, my point here is that service level in the EMAT tool is a great surrogate, I think, for a variety of different outcomes. We have a lot of service. It does a variety of things for us, captures a lot of ridership to address sort of climate impacts that people have brought up, or we have a low level of service, and then that does, the opposite. We either don't have workforce or we don't have funding, that sort of thing. The second driving force that I would suggest we focus on is the telecommuting and work. This is it. We're in such flux right now. I think to John's point, this one is one that we're going to continue to have questions on, and it's going to continue to evolve. So providing RTD information on what future mobility needs, trends, travel patterns might look like under different telecommuting scenarios, I think is an important one for us to look at. And then the third one, I flagged here local policy, because I think this is one that's pretty important, and so important based on what we've heard from this group and from the technical working group, those partnerships. How are we addressing first and last mile issues? And so I think we can do that in that local policy, also through the EMAT, where we talk about how we address local access to station areas and that more local service within a community. Now, there are other questions that I think that we could answer using, there was some really great scenario planning that was using a different sort of methodology that Dr. Cog did. They have some great input for us that we can refer to for Reimagine that addresses land use and land use policy on the whole for the regional area. Costs, which are both parking, fuel, fares, that sort of thing, we can get from Dr. Cog's efforts as well. And then competing modes, auto in particular, if we make the whole system, the autos work really well, then people are gonna less be interested in transit. And of course, if that is not, if we don't go widening our roads and trying to attract a lot more people to autos, we can get more people on transit. And Dr. Cog has done a great job of framing that effort as well. So that I want to throw that out just as a straw man and see how you feel about those driving forces being our focus.
This is Danny. Can I dive in real quick with a question?
Please do.
Hi everyone, Danny Katz with CoPERG. My question is around the service levels, and I guess it's more of a request, is to make the when you're looking at, what can we get with different levels of funding, make sure you look at a lot of funding. So I think too often we're looking at kind of what we have and not, what if we had a lot more? And if we don't measure the kind of service we could have if we had a lot more funding, it's a lot harder to raise a lot more funding, and some of us really would like to do that. So this would be a really helpful opportunity to make sure the high level scenario is high, like really high. Like, this sounds crazy high, because fast tracks, when you think about it, that was a huge amount of money, but the voters approved it. So just wanted to emphasize, whatever that high level scenario is, go beyond. Let's get ridiculous there, because it'd be
Right.
very interesting to see what we could get.
So we put in the background a big transit network, high frequency. It's touching a lot of the region. Any place that seems reasonable to have transit, we have transit. It has high frequency. And then we look at those outputs to see how many people can we actually capture when we do that? Is that your, and then, from the telecommuting perspective, we'll have all the other factors to address as well, but make sure you go big on that transit background. Okay,
Yeah, and just one caveat to that, the way you said it, we did earlier in this whole process, did do an analysis of like, what if we provided transit to a whole bunch of the RTD district, and then what if we provided transit, really good high frequency transit to the most transit dependent communities. If we could divide, we could do the large, like do it all, but I also would be curious to, if we're not necessarily trying to do the geographic, but more the focused on the transit dependent communities, but go really big there too. If we can get into that nuance as well, that would really help, because if I seem to remember, ridership was way higher when we focused in on transit dependent areas and those areas, and less high on the geographic, kind of give everybody everything. So if we can divide that up too, that would also be helpful as well. So thank you.
Yes, that is a good point. So we did do that when we were working on the SOP process, and I'll have to follow up with the people developing, the Cambridge folks and Michelle, on how we can do that regionally. It is very holistic regionally is how we'll be looking at these metrics. So I just need to follow up to make sure that I don't want to slice and dice in some manner that would be giving a false result. Do you know what I mean? If it's more global. So let me look into that. I see where you're going with that, Danny. Thank you.
And we got 2 comments in the chat. We're thumbs up, supporting Danny, agreeing that this is a great approach.
Great.
And then it looks like Commissioner Levy has a question for us about land use assumptions.
Yeah, thanks. So great presentation, and it looks like a really powerful tool, and I'm excited to see what it can produce. So I know land use, as long as I've been involved in issues around land use and transportation and growth in the Front Range area, land use has always been a focus. But, we've never really achieved much with outside of certain really important things like what we've been able to do in Boulder with the hop, skip, jump and increased density. And I wonder what kind of data you have about where that tipping point is. How would we really have to change land use policies to drive additional ridership? Because it is this paradigm that if we changed our land use policies, we'd have greater transit use. But I think over the years, we really have not actually seen the data bear that out, because we fundamentally have a very auto-centric development pattern here. And people are just fundamentally not attuned to using transit as they are in some of the larger East Coast cities. So I do wonder what we know about what it would take in the way of land use policies to actually significantly change ridership numbers.
Yeah, we can absolutely. I think that, and I need to dig into it a little more. I was just scrolling on to see if attendees, to see if we have anybody from Dr. Cog available, but Dr. Cog did some great work in their 2050 planning. And they did some scenario planning, as I had mentioned, and one of the areas that they looked at was land use. And they have some outputs, if the land use policy and the background land use looks like this, here's what happens from the transit perspective. So I think we could pull that information forward and use that to help inform recommendations we make here.
Other questions? What do you guys think? Is this as a good approach? Do you feel like this is missing anything? Does anybody feel like there's an additional driving force that we're not considering?
I guess it is hard for me to imagine what you're inputting to a computer on the local policy on the first and last mile thing. Like I get how you could input funding levels and workforce availability and telecommuting percentages, but what's the input for first and last mile local policy?
Well, okay. So, and Michelle, if you're out there, you might need to jump in here. Here's what I heard from one of the agencies that had used this tool. that I had an opportunity to chat with, it was a surrogate. So in the model, what they did to try to drive that first and last mile, the surrogate was increased travel speed for the pedestrian and increased travel speed for bikes. And Michelle, I don't know if that is globally or if that is locally, but what they did to do a surrogate for that, to say if we have really great local access, the surrogate would be that now you may not actually be walking and biking to use that, it might be a shuttle, it might be scooters, it might be some other method. But the idea was that those two metrics would be the surrogate for helping us understand how, if it was better, that first and last mile was better, how many more people would be attracted to that, some other kind of mode of transportation versus, for instance, driving to a park and ride all the time, that's the way they get to transit. I would say certainly not perfect, but the agency that used it felt that it was resulted in a great surrogate for them and was very informative. So that is a possibility. Again, I'm not wed to that. I throw that out to you all to see if even if that's of interest, that I like it, because I think there's been a lot of dialogue about the local planning and local access. So, but if that's not the right course of action, let's have a dialogue about that.
Yeah, that seems like an interesting idea. I would love to see that data, to just know how you measure kind of walking and biking speeds in a micro environment like that. That would be really interesting for us and a bunch of other policy levels. But it does strike me as it might be just as easy to just do density as because likely you're going to be able to walk and bike. I mean, I guess that's not route. There's not a lot of great bike infrastructure in some of our denser areas, but still, maybe that's an overlap too. But to the extent you have the walking and biking speeds, that seems great. So thanks.
Yeah, I'm gonna elaborate on that a little bit. The density stuff could be addressed in the land use inputs, where we can have different dense scenarios. And then with this first and last mile, it's really, we don't know what kind of mobility might happen in 2050. So it's kind of independent of whether it's a scooter or whatever mode you're taking, but it's just showing that we have different ways and increased options to get to those transit facilities.
I think it's Councilwoman Maurer next. I think we've got some
thank you. I'm just looking at it, and I saw Andrea Suhaka made a comment in the chat, and one thing that I deal with, because I like transit, I like all forms of it, I enjoy it, but I am a very rare person down in the South Metro area, and my thing is I look at how do we make it more attractive, more fun, right? I mean, it's like sometimes if you get that barrier down, you're gonna, and to me, that's the first thing, the first challenge we have is how do you get those barriers down? One thing is people when they go to a sporting event or a concert, it's like, oh yeah, who wants to mess with all the, driving and parking? So that's very attractive. It's fun. You go with your group, right? Then you've got your captive audience that wants to get on that, transit and use it. But otherwise, it's just like this mystery for people. They don't know how to get on the bus. They don't know how much to pay. They don't know what to transfer to. It's like, I got to go online. Do I have this right? And when you're looking to get somewhere on time, say work, then it's like, it's an unknown. And then the other thing is how does it easier for me to take the bus to go down to the grocery store versus just getting in my car? So there has to be that trade-off. And I know I like what Dr. Cog has been doing, like, okay, there's going to be a trade-off at some point, because it's going to take you a long time to use that arterial. So if we have something like a BRT system going, they're going to get preference and they're going to get down the like in our case, Arapahoe Road quicker. So that's a good trade-off time, but there has to be a couple trade-offs to get more people to use that system. So anyway, that's just my thoughts, and I have to leave you guys, and I'm so sorry.
Thank you for joining
Thank
us while
you.
you could.
Thank you. Thank you for following up with us. So we did get a comment in the chat. The councilwoman mentioned that it's really that importance of tying the land use policy to make sure that we're considering transit and transit availability when we're looking at development. Very important. And then we have a correct question from Director Busick. How about the impact of ETRP legislation? Is that assumed in the telecommute work from home component?
Yeah, the tool, and Michelle, chime in on this if I get any of this wrong, but the tool does, because it allows us to look at a wide range of telecommuting, from very little telecommuting to a lot telecommuting in the background, it will take into account the E-Trip recommendations and legislation that's occurring as well.
Great. And then Kevin Flynn, do you want to talk a little bit about your Councilman Flynn, about your concept, really focusing on this workforce challenge and that it is one of the major, more significant things we need to be looking at. Did you want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, I was mindful that when we had very low unemployment, when we had near full employment, RTD was having difficulty recruiting and retaining drivers and operators. Now that we have relatively higher unemployment, driven by the pandemic, we still have driver shortages. The gas stations don't have some types of fuel. Grocery stores are out of certain things. My wife went to a restaurant and they said certain menu items aren't available because their driver hasn't had a delivery in 2 weeks because there's a driver shortage. And so maybe this is a temporary thing that we're seeing because of the COVID related mitigations that we've instilled with the enhanced unemployment that will be coming to an end. But I'd like to see an analysis by your consulting team that looks at the future trends for workforce availability, because all of our goals, like what Danny was suggesting, more frequent service, high frequency service, micro mobility, which are smaller vehicles, which are very personnel driven. You can carry more people on a light rail train than on a shuttle bus, and you still need one operator for each of them. So how will that impact our goal of having high frequency service and micro mobility, first mile, last mile? And I'd like to get a better understanding of that. I don't know what the answer is. I just know that you can't have both. You can't have robust service, high frequency service, and driver shortages.
Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you.
John Taylor, I think you're next.
Sure, just two.
Oh no, I apologize. I skipped Mayor Malay. I'm so
go.
sorry.
Yep.
I'm so sorry, John. Mayor Malay.
Oh, thanks. Hey, John, sorry to cut in front of you. But I guess one of the frustrations that I have in the city of Lone Tree is that we have made, our planning does put high density residential and high density business along our light rail corridor. We have offered free micro transit, on demand transit to solve the first and last mile problem. And I feel like I need more partnership from RTD in attracting riders and making, and I feel like we've done a lot as a community, and I would like to see a more robust partnership with RTD. So when we have Kiewit opening their door with 2,000 employees, literally steps from a light rail station, that they're in their marketing and potentially giving, a free month of ridership on light rail, things like that, that can really, so when day one opens, the Kiewit employee can choose to hop on light rail. I am very concerned with policies that give people no other option or force them to do it. I just think it just seems in Colorado, people rebel against that. If we make it impossible for folks to drive their cars, I don't think that's the reason I want to see them on light rail. I want to see them on light rail because they're choosing it because it's better for their personal mental health. It's better for the environment, and it's a simpler, easier commute for them, not because we've made it so challenging for them to drive their car. And I'd love to see the effort going that way more, and better partnerships with local jurisdictions who have done the right thing as far as land use planning and again, even providing that micro transit. So I kind of feel like I don't know what else I can do in this local community. So pushing it back on land use is frustrating to me.
Thank you for that feedback. Now, John, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's not a problem. I actually just love what the mayor just said. So I will second that, and maybe relates to the two things that I'm going to say. One is just in general, a great proxy for ridership is keypad or keying into buildings. And I just urge RTD to connect with some of the commercial property owners to better understand who they're seeing show up at their offices. That I think is going to be a great ground truth of some of the scenarios that we're exploring. And then that relates to the second thing, which is I do think that we, in all the scenario planning, it's wonderful to just use sort of, your general sense of travel behavior and your general understanding across a region of how people respond to different inputs. But we've got to ground truth it. And so I would just urge us to make sure that we're doing very specific analysis. And so that relates to what the mayor said, which is, I would argue that we should do more of this pilot testing of those kinds of incentives. So when we see a scenario where there's an opportunity to do some sort of micro transit investment, that we as a part of this effort analyze how did it work? How are we seeing the results that the modeling would tell us, so that we have just a number of nodes of evidence that demonstrates that the model is accurate. I mean, that to me is critical if we're going to rely so much on this model, to make sure that we're not just recognizing that maybe it has flaws. So that would be my request.
Yes, I think that is that's a good point. The model is it is not a future. It can't tell you exactly the future, unfortunately, but it is a really terrific and powerful tool to help us, consider those futures. So I agree, some ground truthing when we see those results, will be important.
Wonderful, Holly. Thanks.
We'll plan to do that.
Cool.
And then we just have one more comment in the chat around, let's thinking to the future. What if there is a future fast tracks like proposal, or front range passenger rail, or some large capital investment? Is that something that we would factor in the model, or how would that be addressed in this effort?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that that is. I don't have an exact answer how we'll handle that, but that would be our suggestion as well with those. And I think would be in line with what Danny was saying earlier too, with the service levels, that assume big service levels to see what those outputs look like, on the one end, to try and use that as a surrogate, both for, you have funding, you have workforce, you have perhaps climate mandates, there's a whole host of things that can be a surrogate for. So understanding, that big number, if you have a big investment in transit, what that could look like to the rest of the modes as well, and how much you can capture on transit. So I think that's good.
Well, and if we're following that logic of large service levels, then there would have to be an assumption about additional capacity, correct? Additional infrastructure, most likely.
Yep, exactly.
Other questions, other thoughts? Mr. Welch, sir. Oh, you're muted. Sorry. We got to do that. I think it's the first this meeting. I'm impressed. It looks like you're unmuted now. No, but we can't hear you. Oh. All right, well, we'll work through the technical issues with Brian. Any other thoughts? As Holly said, this is a really important piece. This is the most important piece of this meeting for us, is really making sure that we're all on the same page, that you understand, that we've got this tool, that we're going to have lots of data. We really want to ground truth this. We've got great feedback along those lines. So, is there anything we're missing? Is anybody really looking at this and saying, I don't think this is hitting the mark, or do we feel like this is a logical next step for us?
guess one other question is the cost to the individual consumer to ride transit, is that something that is played with in this model, or is there an assumed same fare for everybody or same pass for everybody?
You know, that there is a cost associated with riding the service in the model. But I don't think this is not really the right tool for us to do a fare analysis. It's pretty, you know, at a pretty gross level. And RTD is doing a very detailed fare analysis study, which is where fares should occur. But there is a cost associated with riding transit in the background, yeah.
But that is being evaluated, I believe. Bill Soroy could probably speak to it in the fare study that is going to be going on for the next, I think it's 18 months or so. Is that correct, Bill?
Yeah, that is correct. And I was also going to say, just to point out to what the slide, so Dr. Cog did do an evaluation of looking at fares as part of that. We can use some of that data to supplement the EMAT tool, like I think is depicted on the slide, so that we can look at, you know, if there are things like free fares or something, what does that do to ridership? As Dr. Cog did do an analysis of that as part of their 2050 RTP process.
I was just thinking outside of like, what's the quote right fare, to Mayor Malay's comment, and also just the e-trip program. We know there may be more and more businesses that see providing passes to people as a tool. And so whatever that cost is, it might be interesting to see, like, if people just had a pass at whatever cost it was, does that, you know, if we could play around with that too, but maybe that's in the fare analysis as well.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that level of detail in the fare analysis, looking at variations in past programs and fares and fare structure, much more detailed than we would be able to in this process.
Great, thank you. And I did want to highlight Brian having technical difficulties, but he did add in the chat. So just very quickly, in summary, you know, we're going to be examining both 2030 and 2050 as a needs-based and physically constrained environment. You know, and the tools, they're really designed to be best at comparing different possible futures rather than accurately predicting. So that's the idea, is you can cut it a lot of different ways and compare across, but it's not necessarily intended to give you the answer for the one assumption. And elected and appointed officials can then make decisions predicated on different possible outcomes and trade-offs. So that's a great summary of sort of what we're trying to accomplish with this tool. So thank you, Brian. It's your last shot. Any other questions before we move on? It's your last chance.
Hey, you guys, it's Jackie again. Marmalade, whatever you. I still am struggling with this forcing people into transit versus incentivizing them into transit. And I'm not quite sure how this tool, like we could put a ton of policies in place that are so burdensome and restrictive that people have no choice. But I kind of go back to when I wanted my kids to love vegetables when they were young. I tried to cook them and present them in a creative, fun way that made them choose that option, recognizing when they got older, and you know, and they were going to make those healthier choices versus. And I'm not quite sure how this tool is going to evaluate really prescriptive policies. It sounds to me like we're forcing people down a path rather than giving them this bright, inviting, flower-lined, drought-resistant, flower-lined path to walk along. And can you help me understand that?
Yeah, okay. And Michelle, I might need some help from you on this, but I would say that the tool itself, you know, the tool is based in the travel demand model. So while there are policies in the background that make up, there was some policy in place that dictated what land use is out there today. It's not really so policy based. It really is about if you have a great transit network and it's fast, it's a lot based on travel time and cost in the background of your time, the value of your time, which is in the background of the model. And then it will assign someone to each person to a mode, depending on where they want to go to. So there's nothing particular that's happening that's forcing. Now, the things that would be where we would be looking at something that would call more policy-based, would really be not from this tool, but from the DRCOG scenario planning, which would be more like policy level decisions on land use that would have a trickle down of how many people would be interested in transit. But those wouldn't really come from the EMAT tool. Those would come from previous DRCOG scenario planning. Does that help at all? I don't know if that answers your question.
I appreciate, yeah, the response, but I guess I continue to question what collaborative policies RTD could be doing, and who is looking at that, and when will that be analyzed?
Okay, that's a good. Now I think I understand now. Apologies, I wasn't quite with you, but so we'll have information. Our goal is to have the information from the EMAT available to you all at the next meeting. And our goal at the next meeting would be to go back to, we started when we reconvened after the pause, we started talking about strategies. And our goal at the next meeting would be to get back into those strategies. So now, based on this information about how the future could possibly look in a variety of ways, let's talk about those strategies. Some of them could be absolutely that local level response. How are you partnering with the local agencies, RTD, to respond to this future? So next meeting is where we'll circle back on some of those strategies.
So we'll be looking for you guys to help us develop that, to answer your point. Absolutely. We have not started with, specific policies in mind. We want to look at the outputs and then back into the strategies that we'll need to work together to accomplish those. Mm-hmm. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. And I apologize, I've got to get on a Metro Mayor's exec call, so I'm hopping off, but thanks everybody.
Thank you so much.
Then it looks like we have one more question from Commissioner Teal.
Hey, thanks, guys. I just wanted to kind of counterpoint the Honorable Lady of Lone Tree, and hopefully she's left the call so she won't have to hear this. No, I'm kidding around. Jackie's a great partner down here in Douglas County. But just to counterpoint though, I'm actually very supportive of this approach, because I think we heard from Commissioner Levy, we heard from a couple of other members, we sort of need to see this analysis, and we sort of need to see the options that kind of go crazy, because I feel it'd be useful to have the information on what the modeling suggests for land use. And as we heard from Mayor Millet, she and her council do feel like they're maximizing their transit supportive land use policies. Whereas here, at least in Douglas County, and I know this exists throughout the metro area, you have other municipalities, perhaps even other counties, that are not so transit focused with their land use. And so being able to see this sort of modeling, even suggesting the going crazy on what would be required for financial support for the transit agency. What effect will we see when we talk about a front range passenger rail and the effects there? And then, quite frankly, being able to see that modeling that does, the phrase wasn't used, but I'll use it, the need for road diets to, make it more difficult for people to use their personal vehicles and go to transit, because that gives us all, as policymakers, the real knowledge and data to say, okay, is this worth it? Is this going to be supported by the 375 bosses I have in Douglas County? Is this going to be supported by the people of the Denver metro area? And so understand where those tipping points could be, where those pain points could be, to where, get us through this crisis and looking into the future on really what RTD does need to look like in order to solve the population of the Denver metro area going into the next generation. So I, for one, am supportive of this approach, knowing full well to actually agree with Mayor Millay that some of that knowledge could be scary. That's okay. Let it be scary. Let us find that path down the middle that has a few more flowers on it to get us into the future. So personally, I liked what I heard. I think it will be useful. It might be news we don't like to hear in some instances. That's okay. I'd rather hear what we don't want to hear and deal with that scenario, deal with those problems, than walk down the primrose path and quite frankly find ourselves 30 years from now and we're still looking at the factors that caused the RTD board to create this effort to reimagine. And we still don't have a transit system that seems to hit what the region really needs. So I'm supportive. I think it's a good way to go.
That's great. Thank you for that feedback.
Great. I think that's it for questions and comments, Holly, at this point.
Okay, good. Thank you all for that discussion. That was incredibly helpful, and I think will help us frame our path forward and the information that we'll bring back to you next time for guiding strategies for the agency. So next meeting, very quickly, our goal is to review the EMAT results and those future scenarios and bring you more information bring back information that DRCOG has done as well in their scenario planning. And I think we'll have a lot of data and information to inform then how RTD should be responding to this. And we're going to want to look at current commitments that RTD has and make sure that those still seem like a good approach for RTD. Does their current workforce structure work? Operational enhancements that they may need to support or respond to some of these scenarios. And then, of course, policies, what policies are in place that are either there and are good and should stay in place, or are there some that need to be put in place that would allow them to respond to the different futures. And to your point, Mr. Teal, that is absolutely, it's a difficult, some of the scenarios may not look as good as others, but it's good to have all the information in front of us and try to make the best decisions we can looking into the future, as informed as possible. So let's go down. At our last meeting, we had an opportunity to talk about RTD being an integrator or a full service provider. And this is one of the aspects where when we look to the future, this is a strategy that RTD can put into place to respond to those different futures. So we'll be informed certainly by our EMAT tool and our scenario planning. But we asked for some initial input and had you use a Mentimeter vote. And we asked you, what side of the spectrum do you see RTD on? And let's have a conversation about that. So at the technical working group, we landed both at the technical working group and the advisory committee. We definitely landed towards the integrator side versus that full provider where RTD would be the operator of, say, bike shares and scooters, but more towards the integrator. Somebody else is operating those, but RTD is integrating with them and integrating their customer service platforms as well. So we also went to the RTD Citizens Advisory Committee, and they landed on a similar side. So we have spent some time looking at the next step, which is what does it really mean for RTD to be an integrator? And Amy Ford is here with us today, and she's going to talk about the approach that we're taking to help better define what that actually means for RTD and for its partner agencies.
Thanks, Holly. And you can flip over. When we talk about what it means to be an integrator, I think there's a lot of interesting points. But the real element of this is that RTD has a framework in which to do analysis, a governance framework, as well as one to be able to establish the partnerships that allow for sort of the enhancement of operations and systems. Doesn't necessarily mean that that is always on an RTD service or it's an RTD platform per se, but it's one where the framework that the agency has to be able to pull all of these different pieces together is one that we continue to look at and pursue. So when we talk about integrator roles, as you look here to the right, they're really sort of three pieces that really compile what it means to be an integrator. The first is really, how do we look at the building of partnerships? Obviously, as our public transit operators within RTD, within CDOT, within other agencies, to the private mobility partnerships that might exist. And obviously, RTD is already moving in that direction, as are our local communities who have engaged in different kinds of partnerships, like, for instance, the one that Mayor Millet was talking about, from corporate, i.e. Kiewit, to others, as our TMAs and TMOs. But the role of RTD to be that player that helps facilitate, to engage, and to pull those partnerships together and leverage the agency of the agency and able to be able to do that. It also is about integrating customer services. And I think that, when we talk about the integration of customer services and the platform that means, it's often construed as a MOS, mobility as a service kind of platform. But the reality is, it's about a customer engagement platform. How do you think about the availability of different kinds of mobility services, to how do you book it, to how do you track what's happening with people onboarding and offboarding? How do you price it? How do you pay it? How do you incentivize it? But ultimately, those analytics to pull all that together. And lastly is that piece of mobility services. And again, you'll see these comparable characteristics of mobility services, from high capacity services that we know RTD is already providing, to those mid-capacity services, our shuttle services and the like, but that are also provided by other providers, to, again, that small capacity service, that micro capacity, if you will, that also includes not just shared rides through carpooling or accessor ride systems or others, but microservices with shared fleet, scooters, bikes, et cetera. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that RTD is doing all of this, as we've clearly identified. It's really how the integration of all those services flow holistically. And so what we're going to be doing in this is looking at the internal structure that RTD has. What capacity does it have to serve in this role? Does it have the tools? Does it have the people? Does it have the structure or the partnership arrangements? What are the policies that allow it to be a good integrator? What is the relationships with the local communities, state and otherwise? Those regulatory environments that impact that, as well as what it means to really build these expectations. So as we move through all of this, if you could flip to the next slide, one of the things that we wanted to frame out was the work that's already been done in this space too. And so more just a report, but as we all know, and I think many of you participated in, the Mobility Choice Blueprint effort was a collective effort between all of these agencies, many of our agencies, DRCOG, CDOT, RTD, and the Metro Chamber, to really create an initiative that looks at how we harness mobility, how we harness the future of mobility, from technologies to different approaches, and really meet these sort of long-term regional goals. I think everyone's pretty aware also that that has advanced now into the Advanced Mobility Partnership, which is essentially taking the framework that was established with Mobility Choice Blueprint and then starting to talk about how do we implement some of these strategies and techniques. These strategies will be part of the overall work that we're doing. As you know, we have a planning effort that is going around a MOS plan, first mile, last mile plan, as well as a parking plan on our infrastructure build, to be able to build these in. And these tactical actions that you see in front of you here, from, let's say, the system optimization to looking at the shared mobility incentives, such as a universal mobility app, how you think about incentives, what we think about curbside management and parking. All of these things identified in the Mobility Choice Blueprint, in addition to the elements and the strategies that you all framed for us a couple of months ago, are going to be part of these plans, but then roll up into the broader framework of integrator. So really just sort of a profile, but what we wanted to do when we talked about that integrator role, and I'd like to open this back up again, is, did we miss anything in those three pieces of what it looks like to see integration? Are there tools or tactics or otherwise that you think that we should be thinking about differently? And does this reflect that role that we see of the future of RTD to continue to serve in that integrator role, albeit not necessarily being the person who offers all of those services? And of course, I whipped through it fast since I know that we have other things on the agenda for Ollie.
Any questions for Amy about this approach? Commissioner Teal.
Sorry, guys, had to get it off mute there. Holly, you stated in the prior segment how exciting and important it was for you guys. The last segment, actually, this is kind of the most exciting segment for me because this is where I really see the future of RTD going in this integrator role. I don't think I have any questions. I liked what Amy just presented. I think it's really captures the direction we have to go. I'd always say, so many times when we talk about transit, we have to talk about the hardware. We have to talk about laying rail lines. We have to talk about the buses, the trains, the equipment we use. But I find this most exciting because of the focus on the individual and the role that the individual expects RTD to play moving into the future. This is where personally I feel like we're getting the biggest bang for the buck with this entire Reimagine process. So I agree with the factors Amy just presented, and I think this is an extremely important direction that we need to be moving in.
Great. Thank you very much for that feedback. Holly, we also got a comment in the chat about really needed to integrate with the Metro Mayor's Caucus. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that could be something we can talk about a little bit more detail at the next meeting when we're really outlining strategies and how we would actually implement some of this. So I think that's a great comment as well. Other thoughts before we got a thumbs up too from Director Williams. Thank you, Kate. I think that's all we have comment-wise for now.
All right, super. Thank you so much, Amy. Next up, we have a couple of quick updates. We have updates on where we stand with the electrification work that is happening. We'll keep it at a pretty high level today, and if you want more details, we can open it up to questions. And then we're going to talk about the facilities, and we're going to keep that at a really high level, but we're going to talk about the facilities evaluation as well. So Cliff Hankey with WSP has joined us and is going to give us an overview of the electrification tasks that are underway.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see you all again, and enjoy this this dialogue. It's always nice to talk about the future, right? So what we've been doing in the last few months and what we'll be doing throughout the summer is coordinating with the facilities team about the electrification assessment. So they'll be visiting the facilities and looking at future service expansion needs, modifications, state of good repair, et cetera, that Kerry will get into in a moment. But they will also be looking at the electrification assessments, what's needed to transition to full electrification. And then we've been involved in the development of an infrastructure and fleet acquisition phasing schedule, starting with the fleet acquisition plan that RTD already has. But it's basically kind of a straw man dummy kind of template at this point. This will be refined based on the findings. And then what we really are involved in right now is the preparation of the modeling. And so I'm going to get into our modeling methodology in a second, but we're also developing a narrative for this. And just so that everybody understands, the best data that we had available from RTD was the 2019 fleet data, and we're using that data in order to stay on schedule. And then finally, we will finalize these analyses and do an implementation recommendation this fall in October. So you'll see all of that, progress on all of that in the next one. So as you probably know, it's not just about buying a bunch of batteries and chargers. This also has to do with the operations, the best fit, the phasing of these implementations in particular, as I mentioned, the fleet power requirements and the infrastructure modifications that Excel needs to do in order to accommodate this this fleet transition. And then, of course, the capital and operating costs associated with this. We talked earlier about the operations constraints and the capital constraints with respect to the future mobility picture. This is one of them. Because it's going to drive cost and it's going to drive probably service availability to some extent. Well, how do we account for that sort of onion being peeled away? And it's in the form of simulation modeling. We can best use that data and see how these new technologies will behave on that network. So we have several modeling tools and can provide lots of levels of analyses with these modeling tools. The first and the one that we'll rely on the most is Lightning Bolt, which is a sketch planning tool that will look at the block completion rates with current battery electric or fuel cell bus technology, but also we will look at a deeper dive with Lightning Bolt on future trends with respect to these technologies as they go forward. It's assumed that they will improve. We've got lots of good data, marketplace data to show that they will be improving, say 5% a year on average. And so we'll build that into the level of analysis as well. And we'll look at recommendations for any service adjustments that are needed. And we'll also look at infrastructure such as what's called opportunity charging. That is to say, chargers on the route network somewhere that will allow the full completion of the service if it's needed. And so we refine all of that. We've actually upgraded our Lightning Bolt tool, our sketch planning tool, so that we don't really think that the full, very sophisticated Bolt model tool that we've developed is needed. We think we can do all of this with the Lightning Bolt tool, but we have the Bolt tool as a backup that really gets into some of the very refined behaviors of a vehicle, and I'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. So we look at this through a variety of inputs: the existing schedule, as I mentioned before, the vehicle preferences and changes, the vehicle assignments, what's called the block assignments, where the divisions are located, and what kind of capacity using electrification technology or alternative technology those divisions will accommodate, which turns into deadhead trips, non-revenue trips, those trips where you go from the division out to the actual service. All of that affects battery usage, of course, or fuel cell usage. And then, of course, how ridership might drive this as well will also be accommodated within the inputs. We'll also look at elevation, all of the onboard technologies, such as the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems. We'll also look at stops, because the length of the stop also dictates just how much that battery gets eaten up. And so all of this is modeled through what we call state of charge. And that state of charge, particularly when it returns back to the barn, so to speak, will drive how much electricity draw at each of the divisions is needed, and what will tell Excel as far as the energy draw and the infrastructure requirements that are needed both at the division, but possibly the circuits of the electricity of the grid as well. And so we model all these things. We measure all of these things within this model, including topography and climate, the severity of the winter and the summers in the Denver service area. And so what are the outputs? The outputs that you'll be looking at later this fall will be things like the facility needs, the kinds of vehicle technology that's needed, the vehicle replacement ratio, the charging and operation strategy, the load profiles, as I mentioned, and then also the charging equipment that's required, the best fit charging strategy, and then the strategic transition phasing, which divisions go first in this electrification. And then all of that, of course, gets fed into our cost models that Simon talked about for the future. We'll be modeling, this will all get to the answers of what can be done by 2030, which was the first question that was posed to us, as well as what will it take to transition the entire fleet by 2050. What you're seeing here that Holly is taking through are the variety of outputs that we'll have in the model results that are proposed. We'll do it by division, we'll do it by phase, we'll do it by block completion rates, we'll do it at the network level as well, and we'll do it at the grid level and the demand level for the grid. And you'll see all of those outputs when the actual results will be presented. We hope to have some results for you in the next meeting, but that's basically it in a nutshell. And I am happy to answer any questions.
It does look like something came in the chat, Julie.
Yes, and Commissioner Teal had a comment as well. So maybe we start there and then we'll jump to the chat.
Yeah, so the question about, go ahead, I'm sorry, Commissioner.
Oh, just so question, is there a factor in this analysis that includes different size equipment, so different size buses that could be electrified to handle different capacity on different routes?
Yeah, I skipped over that. Yes, indeed. Yeah, we'll look at all models, battery sizes, future projections of batteries as well, future efficiency improvements that based on industry literature. And the way we do this in Lightning Bolt is we develop a sort of safety range. And in some of those outputs that Holly put up, you'll see conservative estimates versus less conservative estimates. Those are the kinds of things that will, optimistic estimates as well. And so we sort of look at a medium, conservative, and optimistic range for just how the technology might behave on the route structure. What we'd like to do as well is do a kind of a quick analysis, although I think this is really going to be sussed out more in the capital and operating numbers that we give Simon for the 2050 horizon. But those outputs will definitely have sort of a range of how we think the technology will behave in Denver on RTD's network.
Okay, cool. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Andrea in the chat. Would it be possible to put solar cells as a cap on all parking garages or parking lots?
So it is possible. I'm not, is that part of our scope of work, Holly? I'm not really sure. I mean, we can do that, but we'll have to chat about that and just how much time we want to spend on that alternative. We have certainly done that for a variety of agencies around the country, not least of which is in Los Angeles, where we think a few megawatts per division will help buy down the cost, particularly any draw during the day that might be needed. And it might help at night as well. We'll also look at storage technologies and how that might help. We have that full capability, but I'm not sure how much of that we can do within the scope we've got. We'll have to talk about that, right?
Yeah, it may be the way to it's not called out in our scope of work, Cliff, but maybe the thing to do would be to, if as you're going through the process, you think that is something that RTD should follow up on, that, as a potential future strategy, we can flag that as a, sort of next step. But
yeah, absolutely.
We can talk about how to handle
flag those issues of what we think might be the potential for doing various things. And that gets to a sort of a corollary of your question, which is, what are the impacts of doing more en route charging? What we're finding nationwide, for example, is that one way to buy down the peak draw and to help the utility, so to speak, is to do more en route charging, so-called opportunity charging at the layovers, which will help the state of charge, as it returns back to the division. And that also helps so that optimization will also be something that we'll look at. And because we're using the light bullet sketch planning tool, we can do sort of scenario planning in that way.
And I think that does get more to Andrew's question. She had a clarification that she was talking about energies for the buses specifically. So
yeah, I see. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We also got a question from Director Williams. Will we also be looking at hydrogen fuel cell vehicles?
Yes. That's why I put up some of the outputs comparing hydrogen fuel cell.
All right. Any other questions for Cliff?
What's interesting about hydrogen fuel cell is that, yes, it does have much better range than battery electric buses. But when you then add opportunity en route charging, it actually performs better than hydrogen fuel cell, particularly in the capital investment side of this. So it's an interesting balance, but because of the terrain in Denver, it may actually advantage. We looked at, some of the rather steep routes in San Bernardino County, for example, and we found that a lot of that, what we thought would be more eligible for hydrogen fuel cell, it looked better when you optimized the battery electric with some opportunity charging. So it's another interesting sort of thing that's happening in the market.
Interesting. And kind of following on that, we got a question about trolley buses. Would they be feasible on top of battery?
Again, that's not part of our scope, but here's the thing with trolley buses. It requires, you could imagine, substantial investments in wires, overhead catenary, substations, et cetera, which are probably substantially more. So we could look at it. We are looking at it for Seattle and San Francisco because they have existing trolley bus networks. But it's one of the major reasons why you're seeing over time fewer, basically there's a couple of cities in the last couple of decades that have eliminated their trolley bus networks. It's a substantial capital and operating investment.
Interesting. And then one more comment from Director Williams, see if you have a thought on this, Cliff. Her concern is that if we completely invest in electric, that we may miss out on hydrogen as it becomes more developed over time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we are going to try to future-proof this so that there may be improvements. We try to do as much as possible in improving both hydrogen and battery electric with respect to what's the best technology, not just today, steady state, but also over time. So we'll look at those options and trade-offs.
Okay. Other thoughts, other questions for Cliff? I think we can move on to the next section.
Thanks, Cliff. Okay,
Sure.
Next piece, as we're talking about making modifications to the fleet, of course, there are modifications that are associated with the facilities as well. And I think Carrie with WSP is on the line to give us an update on their work effort for that.
Yeah. So as Cliff indicated, we have two main focuses right now. We have for each facility, we're going to advise on the site improvement priorities that are needed to maintain a state of good repair and to maintain the current service levels at each facility. And then two, we're going to investigate the possibility of BEB site electrification at each site, and then advise on the challenges presented by each of the sites. And then we also have a rail component to our work. So we're going to have our rail side of facilities look at the rail maintenance facilities, look at the capacity of those facilities, and then see how that capacity might be affected by any sort of increase in ridership. And so we've been developing some drawings, and based on what has been previously published, based on what we could get our hands on, this is a draft example of some of the drawings. This is East Metro. And we're going to have these drawings in our hands, and we're going to actually be on site throughout next week at each of the sites. And we're going to be looking at some of the major, if you can go back to the first one, because I'm going to try to concentrate on that one. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So we're going to be on site, and we're going to be looking at the facility. We're going to be looking at the building envelope, the roof, the walls, the HVAC system, the site pavement, the plumbing, all of this, building related stuff. And in our hands, we're going to have the 2020 TAMP plan, which was submitted to the FTA, and that sort of identifies items that are planned for funding on the next, I think, 5 years, and for these facilities. And we're going to be reviewing that, commenting on that, double checking, making sure, seeing if we can add to any of that, any of those funding opportunities in terms of what we think is a priority. On top of that, we're going to be out there looking for obviously BEB electrification opportunities to see what it is that we need on site to make electrification for battery electric buses possible. And that's going to include all sorts of things like not only your bus sizes and types, but the actual quantities of each type of bus, the parking orientation of the bus, the clear height for any sort of interior parking. So how much space do we have between the floor and the underside of the structure? The location of electrical utilities, the location of storm sewers for our outdoor parking areas. All of these things are going to affect any sort of strategy that we may have for electrifying any particular site. And so this is, like I said, East Metro. And so, for example, on here, what we want to be, well, I'm sorry, go back to the previous one. I thought we were just going to concentrate on the first one. Sorry about that.
Yes, that I think that's good. Unless somebody has a particular question about one of the other facilities.
Yeah, I mean, we can go over them. It's just that this, I think, is very representative of all of them. So
perfect.
So this was gonna, so basically what this drawing is showing in red, the sort of inbound traffic flow of buses. In blue, it's showing the on-site circulation, and in green, it's showing how the buses exit. This is our guess. We need to go out there and we need to confirm it. And this becomes important because, again, it affects exactly how they're pulling into it. It affects, if they're utilizing bus handlers that will then, do an initial park and then take it out and then fuel and wash it and then park it again. That would affect how much time that we have overnight to be able to charge the buses. And so in addition to that, what we want to look at is, as BEB or bus electrification is implemented into the site, you're going to have to mark off zones for the contractor to come in and to be able to physically construct the components of that system. And so what do we do with those buses? What do we do with those existing buses that still have to go on their routes? And so we're looking at opportunities to try to keep, as much as possible, the buses parked onto the site so that we don't have to transport them to a different site and have them operate from there for a given time. It makes it a little bit more efficient. And so we're going to be looking at that as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Did you have more?
No, that's mainly it. I was just going to try to wrap it up a little bit, but I mean, those are the big things that we're going to be looking at. And we have several drawings. This was representative of all the facilities. And so, yeah. Happy to answer any questions.
So I do have a question just based on the last round of comments we had for when we were talking about the electrification, and people ask about hydrogen. Will you have anything from the facility side that will consider that as well, or are you mainly focused on sort of what we think of in traditional electrification?
Our scope of work was very, very specific as to electrification. I think we can look at SM hydrogen. We can look at that and see what that is. I will say that the infrastructure for electrification is far more significant and invasive than it would be for hydrogen. If you're going to do something, CNG, hydrogen, whatever, it's not going to be terribly dissimilar to diesel in some of the infrastructure and some of the equipment that you need on site. And But electric, on the other hand, you're essentially powering your buses in a completely different manner. It's overnight. It's a longer term, quote unquote, fueling process. And so it's a little bit more invasive. And so a great deal more of planning needs to occur to make sure that that goes off without a hitch.
Okay. Yeah, I guess based on the comments that we received just earlier in the chat, when we were talking with Cliff, I think maybe just a little circling around to make sure that we give RTD enough information to just have a bit of information on that for that comparative purposes would be helpful.
We have
Okay, any other questions for Carrie?
Well, we have just a comment from Director Williams, just making the point that there isn't any hydrogen available in Colorado at this time. So that's a good point.
Yep.
Other thoughts or questions on the facilities work?
This is Cliff again. Just to mention something else about hydrogen is that even if hydrogen does become available, it's often the result of a reformed natural gas. So from a well-to-wheels analysis, it may not be politically advantageous to go to hydrogen because it comes from, a source that isn't, that's basically, now there is electrolytic hydrogen, which means it comes from, electricity converting, water, splitting water to hydrogen basically. But it gets into other environmental related issues like potable water and available water sources, particularly in very dry Western United States. I mean, it's again part of the onion to be peeled, but there's a number of sort of considerations.
Thank you, Cliff. Any other thoughts, questions?
And then the question about in the chat, there is definitely aspects of battery technology either.
Yeah, because you have your batteries and what to do with them after they after their useful life is over. Yeah, it's an issue. It needs to be addressed.
Not only its afterlife, so to speak, but it's also its sourcing and what parts of the world they come from. And
that's a good point.
Yep.
Great point.
All right, Julie, we are on the last section, certainly not the least, but Julie's going to give us an update on our public engagement activities.
Thank you so much to everybody for hanging in there with us. This is the kind of the wrap up here from a public engagement perspective. What we have been focusing on over the last few months is very similar to the exercise we did with you, it's 2 or 3 months ago where we started with the strategies. So we have our guiding principles. They were approved by the RTD Board of Directors, and we've been meeting with individual groups to have conversations about what strategies do we need to work together to be able to achieve, the premise that are set up through the guiding principles. So we're going to be continuing. So we'll be reaching out to a few of you, wanting to do some TMOs and TMAs. We're really focusing over the next couple of months on folks that are sort of industry knowledgeable that really can help us develop strategies out of whole cloth, because you understand enough about the industry, you understand what we're trying to accomplish. So our focus over the next couple of months is going to be TMOs, TMAs. We've got a local governments team meeting on the 22nd. We are continuing our online engagement, which is, it's really fun. It's set up as an idea wall. So you can type in strategies, you can respond to other people's strategies, you can like them, you can dislike them. So it's kind of a fun interactive tool that we have online right now. And we're going to do a second round we're calling our community advocacy groups. So it was about early summer last year, and we met with the Colorado Center for the Blind and several of the LCCs and the AFL-CIO, really just trying to reach out to some groups that have not historically had a place at the table, especially on these types of issues. And what's great about the initial meetings we had last summer is they were the groups that helped us, along with you and a lot of others, develop those guiding principles. So now we're going to go back to them and say, now that we have the guiding principles, work with us, help us identify, where to go from here. So we haven't been doing a lot of, and you might have noticed a lot of real public facing over the summer. Part of that is strategic. RTD has a million things going on. They've got the FAIR studies and the strategic plan and the accountability committee. And there's so much going on right now that we we didn't, we wanted to pause a little bit from the public perspective, just not to confuse people, not to go back to the same sources over and over again and say, well, now we're talking about something else with RTD. That said, we are hitting it hard in the fall. In the fall, you're going to see a lot of us. We are going to be doing a new online engagement tool that we're pretty excited about. This will be the point where, with your help, we're actually going to have some draft strategies for individuals in the public and different groups to respond to. So we like I said, update our engagement tool. We're doing 15 telephone town halls, one for each board member's district. We're doing a series of public meetings, hopefully face-to-face. We'll see how that goes. We're going to be doing tons of individual meetings with local municipalities and chambers, and some customer outreach, really trying to get to the customer, specifically to talk about these strategies. And I'm working with RTD on a youth listening session. So part of what I'm also excited about in this fall and winter timeframe is RTD has hired a new individual as the transit equity lead, and he is working on overall RTD's methodology for reaching some of these groups that historically have not been as engaged, developing longer term relationships, perhaps even some incentives to get those folks engaged. So just we're going to be working hand in glove with that group as we move into the fall and winter, but that's going to be our big push through the end of the year. And then hopefully by the end of the year, then in that January, February timeframe, we'll be working more directly with our board of directors, but we will be doing another round of outreach at that point. Some public meetings, and as well as we are going to put a video together at the end of this that just sort of highlights what we accomplished, what are the next steps moving from here. So like I said, we've been a little quiet over the last few weeks, but come fall, especially once we get a point where we have some strategies at least articulated that we can start getting reactions to, you're going to be seeing a lot of us coming in the fall. So we'll be reaching out to you to help get the word out and to help set up meetings and to help identify who we should be meeting with. So if you have any ideas in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out to me or anybody on the project team, because we always love hearing from you. And we are more than happy to set up meetings individually as you guys have a need. So any questions, any thoughts on public engagement? All right, Holly, I'll hand it off to you to bring us home.
All right. Well, that's all we've got for today. I don't know that we have flagged the actual date. Did I miss an actual date for the rebuilding service subgroup meeting?
We are looking early August. It has not, an official date has not been set yet, but we'll probably get that out next week.
But next meetings for this group will be early September. They should already be on your calendar with any luck. And I'm just going to tell you right now that the appointments are a little kooky for some reason. Sometimes what I have in my appointment is not translating to you. So apologies when you get a couple of extra reminders for me, but I want to make sure that everybody has the right access to the meeting. So that's all we have for today. If you have any other comments, questions, we can stay on for a minute. We've got a little time, but otherwise we're done with the material, and appreciate your time today and your input. Bill or Brian, anything from your end?
Oh, thank you very much for participating. We had great dialogue with everyone today, and really appreciate your input and your participation in this important project.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll talk to you next time. You'll see some dialogue from us in between meetings, but otherwise we'll make sure to connect in a couple months. All right, thanks all.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.